Welcome to the Election University podcast, a weekly show where we hear from industry experts who share tips and tricks for winning campaigns. Whether you're running for office now, thinking about it for the future, or just want to know more about campaigns and elections, Election University is for you. With Election University, click, learn, win. And now your host, Jason Bennett and Rainey Cohen.
Hello, everybody.
Hello.
Welcome back to another episode of Election University Podcast. I'm your host, Jason Bennett.
And I'm Rainey Cohen.
Thanks so much for tuning in today. We are very excited about today's guest. We are going to talk to New York Assemblywoman Yuh-Line Niou, who was elected in 2016 and is the first Asian American woman, first Asian American period, to represent Chinatown and parts of Wall Street in the Manhattan district that she represents, District 65. And we're going to talk to her about young people running for office and taking over. I'm excited about today's episode.
Absolutely. I can't wait to hear how she got motivated to run for office at such a young age. Like, what inspires you to come in and take over and decide you're not going to wait in line for your turn? You know, as so many women, especially and young people, are told, wait your turn. That seat will be open in 20 years for you.
Right. Or you're accused of not having enough experience. But listen to this resume. If you can take the time out of your schedule to listen to this resume. Not only was she elected and was successful in her election, which we're going to talk about the details of. She was the former chief of staff for the Assemblymember Ron Kim in the 40th Legislative District. She was an independent consultant. She was a special assistant to the Assistant Administrator, Michelle DePass, at the EPA. And as we know her in Washington State, a longtime advocate and legislative aide in Olympia in Washington State. So big resume.
Yeah. She also worked specifically in the Washington State Legislature to increase language access all around the legislature so that people who don't speak English primarily can participate in the process. She's just done some really cool things around accessibility. Can't wait.
So without, delaying this fantastic interview any longer, let's get right into it. Assemblywoman Niou, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. I actually feel like I'm freezing here in New York and thinking about Seattle from afar.
Well, it is a little bit warm today, so we'll try and send some sunshine your direction.
Well, don't rub it in, Rainey.
Before we get started, can you please tell us a little bit of your background, how it came to be that you're with us today, giving great advice for other young candidates who are thinking about running for office?
So I guess I have to start, of course, with my immigrant story. My parents actually came to the United States from Taiwan when I was only 6 months old. They came to the States with a 6-month-old, 6 suitcases, and about $1,000.
Wow.
And it was my father who had a scholarship to attend the University of Idaho, one of the obviously most liberal places on the planet. Just kidding. So, yes, we went to Moscow, Idaho, which was the first place that we immigrated to. And unfortunately, that is also the hub of the KKK and neo-Nazis in America. And, there was some things in, daycare, et cetera, that made it so my parents really felt like they would never put their kids in daycare again, that they were going to ask my grandmother to come and take care of us. And so that's kind of how our family started out here in the U.S. And then his education took us to Beaverton, Oregon, and then to El Paso, Texas. So all amazing places to grow up. And then, my dad, he found his job in Vancouver, Washington, and that's when I first became a Washingtonian. And I went to college at the Evergreen State College, go Gooey Ducks, in Washington State. And that was actually where I became a legislative intern. I became a legislative intern in the Washington State Legislature when I was going to Evergreen, and I knew that I wanted to see how government worked, how government operated, because I always felt like there was a lot of things when I was growing up in El Paso, in watching my parents as immigrants. struggling with some of the things that they struggled with and going to school and struggling with the things that I struggled with, that there were so many injustices that I wanted to see how the government works so that, in a lot of ways that I could go in and become an advocate and disrupt the system and try to break things, I guess, and make things better for folks who haven't had a voice in our government system. When I got there, though, I realized a big secret. And it was really an interesting experience for me because I worked for two women. I worked for Senator Karen Fraser and Senator Debbie Regala. And Debbie was actually the whip at the time, and Senator Fraser was actually chair of the international caucus. And so they actually worked on international issues, which is really interesting because on both fronts, I got to learn a lot of how leadership worked, and I got to work with women in the legislature. That changed my perspective so much. And I also realized, going back to the big secret, that government was completely accessible. That government was something that was touchable for those who knew how to touch it. The big secret that everybody, doesn't want us to know is that we can make change, that we can touch government. People who are in power don't want other people to know that.
Right.
People who are in power don't want people to know that it's completely touchable and accessible as long as we reach out and do it. And so I wanted to bring that news to everyone, and I wanted to make sure that folks who never historically had a voice in government knew that they actually had an opportunity to speak up, to touch government in a big way. And so, I think a lot of people in the United States, they think the way that I did, that government was this ephemeral, untouchable thing in the ether, right? Something that just made rules and then we had to follow them. And I couldn't ever go and speak up for myself. Being face to face with the government and as a legislative intern, I got to see that I was wrong, that, it's something that we can access, that we can change. And so I worked really hard to make the change that I wanted to see. I know that is very cliche in a lot of ways, but I think that little by little, I got to also learn from mentors. A lot of you guys know Representative Sharon Tomiko Santos and Representative Velma Valoria. Both of them were two of the first Asian American women ever elected to state office anywhere. And so, to be able to work with them, to be able to see them in action, to be able to have role models like that made a big difference. They made human trafficking an issue. They made issues that were relevant to our communities of color, issues that people started to think about in mainstream politics. And that really changed my perspective. And so I was able to watch all of that as a legislative intern in Washington State. Then I became a staffer for Representative Eileen Cody. She's still the healthcare chair in Washington State, and she was incredible. If you ever want to hear somebody who's a straight shooter talk about healthcare and talk about those who have and those who have not, and the folks who are getting taken advantage of by a system that is broken, talk to her about all of these things. And she does not hold back when it comes to language or being PC. She's amazing. And she was somebody who I really, really looked up to because she was a nurse and my mom was a nurse. And, we worked on things like the lifting bill, and it changed my life, because I really got to see how an advocate for patients and an advocate for workers was able to become leadership as a woman and put that woman's perspective into how to make policy, and that policy changed so many lives. She was one of the first to pass an HPV vaccine bill. She changed how healthcare looked in Washington State for women. It was really incredible to be able to be a mentee of hers and work for her for that many years. Later on, I became the lobbyist for a group called the Statewide Poverty Action Network, the lobbyist regulating the payday lending industry and working on asset building programs for the state. That was one of my biggest bills, and I think one of my biggest accomplishments to date. I know people might say winning office was one of the biggest things you've ever done, but but I actually think that saving working families $150 million in fees every single year based off of that bill regulating those payday lenders and their predatory lending practices was probably the biggest thing and the thing I've been most proud of my whole life, because those fees are incredibly, incredibly dangerous and help to make people impoverished, really. It drives people into a cycle of poverty that will, make people homeless and have high foreclosure rates. And they prey on people of color. They prey on tribes. They prey on the military. It's really, really scary. And so I was very, very proud to be able to regulate that industry and to be able to bring financial literacy and asset building programs and the EITC tax credit into Washington State with one of my mentors, Tony Lee. And so that was an incredible way of being able to see where my voice as an advocate could really shape policy myself, working with all of these amazing advocates. And I also got to see how coalition building could be so powerful. We were building coalitions that never had been built before, and during this time, I also noticed that people of color in Washington State, people of color and our communities of color, they didn't have the resources that other organizations had or other special interest groups had in hiring a lobbyist. Even Statewide Poverty Action Network had me as their lobbyist, but the community organizations of color, none of them had their own lobbyist. And it was one of the things that was most noticeably missing in our legislature. Whenever people were testifying about a bill or talking about an issue that had to do with communities of color, many of the communities of color that were actually being focused on for these issues, they weren't at the table. Many of these community of colors leaders weren't at the table for the budget discussions that could highly impact our communities. And so, one of the things that I took from working at Poverty Action and that huge thought of coalition building, which was being put to use. And so I decided to help to form something that we called the Lobbyists of Color Coalition. So we founded, it was just basically me and a handful of my friends, it was like me and I saw that we had a handful of us that represented different groups across the state, but we didn't have anybody representing people of color directly. And it started really simply. I just put together a bill tracker, and that bill tracker was a way that we could all see what issues would actually impact communities of color. And then I sent them to organizations that maybe had a say or maybe wanted to have a say in those issues. And so it was very simple, but it made it so that all of these organizations also knew when these bills were moving, when these bills were starting to be heard in public hearings, and then when they were moving through committee and when things were going to be on the floor for a vote. That way they can keep an eye and keep track of certain issues. And later on, as you guys probably know, that the Lobbyists of Color Coalition became what is now known as the Racial Equity Team.
So then how did all of this lead you to decide to actually run for office?
So I never actually wanted to run for office. That was probably one of the biggest indicators that I should, right? I never wanted to run for office. I always thought that I was the best behind the scenes, that I was the person that was the best as an advocate. Most people don't know that, I wrote a bill to regulate the payday lending industry, that I was the person to put together that initial tracker for the Racial Equity Team, and that, it started as a brainstorm in my basement. I think that I've always been very, very comfortable being in the background as somebody who is a servant leader. And I think that that's still the leadership style that I adhere to. Servant leadership is really kind of, I don't know if people really know the definition of it, but I can kind of talk about it a little bit, but it really kind of puts the needs of others first and then helps people, I guess, develop and perform for each other. And I think that it's really about turning that power pyramid upside down, that people can work to serve as an example of leadership, and that leader exists to serve others. I didn't think of myself as a leader. I didn't think of myself as somebody who could lead a group or anything like that. I thought I was too shy. I was too introverted. When I first saw what had happened in my district at the time of Sheldon Silver's indictment and then conviction, and then when we didn't have an assembly person in the seat, I saw the bleeding that was happening for the district. And I also had worked for Assemblymember Ron Kim as his chief of staff for about 3.5 years by then. And Ron was the only Asian American elected on the state level at the time. So it's really incredible to see that, because we are more than 10% of the state's population, Asian Americans are, and yet we had less than 1% of the representation. Even with my election, we still have less than 1% of the representation. We have 0.8. And I just thought to myself how this could be and why it would be so important to serve my district in this way. And I put myself out there, and, I worked really hard, and my district really wanted to change. And so when they saw that I knew how the legislature worked, I was intent on bringing services to our district. I think that I was that change that they wanted. So, that's kind of where we are now.
That's great.
My first year, and this is my second year now. So this is my first term, and in my second half of it.
So there are listeners to the podcast who I think are probably mulling a potential run, and are, you had talked a little bit about access to government and how touchable it is, or, how certain power brokers, hoard the information and keep it from folks. If there are folks who are thinking about running for office and they're thinking about maybe even starting a political career, what advice would you give them if they're just starting out? What should they have in their minds? What should be part of their next step plan?
I think looking back on my internship and how it kind of gave me a really great platform to learn, I think that understanding issues is really the key. If you want to change the system, you need to understand how it works. I think that understanding the issues that are important to you and your community, and then also understanding that all issues, and I know that most people will think about it in a different way, but all issues, there is no wrong answer, right? In a lot of ways, there's reasons why people think the way they do. There's reasons why every perspective has their right? Like there's like the reason why they think that they're right, and then there's also, reasons why those issues become issues. So everything's very, very layered. And I think that if you can understand all of these different issues in all of these different ways, you can build policy in the best way. You become a real advocate for the communities that you're trying to represent, because it really makes a difference by knowing how issues can be layered and how issues, how everybody's perspective can be right partially or right all the way or right somehow. And it makes it so that you become able to navigate all of those things in order to make it so that you have the best policy moving forward. And, one of the examples I guess I can give is that, payday lending issue that I was talking about. There's a reason why some communities of color think that payday lenders are not predatory, because historically they have never been lent to. So if you think about it that way, then you can understand why payday lenders still have business and,
right.
What it is about banks that aren't serving certain communities. So certain communities are underserved by traditional mainstream banking system, and what reason is it? And we have to think about why it's not like anything is particularly wrong with certain communities wanting a certain product, but it's about saying, like, why is it that these communities are underserved, right? And so, like, you have to look at how the layers are working, and you're not saying, like, oh, that community is wrong for wanting that product, because how could they be stupid to not know that this is a predatory product on them? Right. And continue to use this terrible thing. It's really about, like, learning the history, learning how these layers work, and then looking at how to better change these policies. And I think that understanding these issues is so key. And if you just work to understand different issues and really understand how policy works, you can get a huge head start.
Just to summarize, I want to maybe pull back a little bit on this. What you're saying is find some way to get an understanding of what the system is like, right? So if you're running for the legislature, get an internship in Olympia, or your Albany, or your state capital.
Olympia.
I know. I'm trying hard not to stay focused on our area. This is a national broadcast, so wherever your capital is, find an internship that works there. If you're interested in a city council race, city chancellor, whatever, you should learn the issues that are impacting that particular city council. And one of the other things that, just to go back to something that you said earlier, mentorship seems like it was really important to help kind of set you on this path a little bit. How do you find your mentors? Like how did you decide who was going to help you through this process and kind of guide you along?
Oh, that is such a good question because I owe so much to all of my mentors. And I was lucky in a lot of ways because what other state had these amazing people, in office? Right. There were so few states with Asian American electeds. There were so few states with Asian women elected. There were so few states with women elected, period. Washington State at the time of my internship had more women elected than men elected. Like, it was amazing. I was floored by that statistic. It's not the same in any other state. When I was working as an intern, Gary Locke was becoming the governor. Right. And that was the first time that I had ever seen an Asian American governor. Now he was the first and one of the only. And so it was eye opening, and I felt that momentum, and I was lucky enough to be in that place at that time. Unfortunately, that's not the case for so many young folks across the country and so many different states. There's so little representation from folks that look and speak and care about the same things that we do. So, and I think that mentorship is pretty much the reason why I was able to even have the guts to be able to give it a shot, to even be able to stay in the legislature, even when it was hard, and to be able to work on all of these issues and advocate the way that I did. Because of the folks that were my mentors, I can only say that it made it so that I had a perspective that things were possible. I think that a lot of people are coming from a perspective of sadness and we need to do something and desperation because of some of the things that have been going on, and people are giving up or are more motivated than ever but have no idea how to do it. And whereas I had like a very clear mentorship path that was laid out for me that made it so that I could see that at the very end, like, there is a possible way to do it because somebody else had done it before me. And so I think that it's really great that you guys are doing these podcasts because I think it makes it so that other people can see that, yes, it's actually possible, no matter how impossible it might seem.
Well, and thank you for joining us on the podcast to show that it is possible as one of the younger people to get elected to a state assembly. But because we are training people how to do campaigns, let's talk specifically about your campaign for a couple of minutes. Sure. Will you walk us through some of the dynamics, like how much money did you raise and how many endorsements did you get, and was that a struggle? How many voters were you able to contact personally, and what some of that was like? Yeah,
so let's start with the door knocking and how big the district is and things like that. So my district is quite large. I represent the Lower East Side, the South Street Seaport area, Chinatown Financial District, and Battery Park City, which is basically the entire tip of Manhattan. And I think that when people think about how many people that might be, we have to, kind of represent everyone. And it's a very, very diverse, socioeconomically and racially diverse district. All these different communities coming together, and that is Lower Manhattan. It's one of the most epic, most beautiful, amazing places you could possibly be. My district also happens to be the birthplace of America. I know that a lot of people probably are like, wow, it's what? George Washington and the Culper Spies and everything, like Francis Tavern right down the street from me right now is where America first started. And the Statue of Liberty stands right in my district. And it's also where the first immigrants came, and I think that it's kind of incredible to be a part of that and be a part of its history now. I had to door knock around 9,000 doors myself, going up and down the stairs, making sure that I was able to meet and greet as many people in person as possible. I actually had a car accident about a year and a half ago, I guess almost. It was in February of the year that I was running. So it was like a very difficult thing to kind of overcome because it made it so that I was like slower on the stairs, not as able to walk as much as I wanted to, and not be able to have the endurance and stamina that I had at the very beginning of my race. And so, 9,000 doors is still a lot, but I was pushing myself, and you kind of have to be that person when you're running. I raised, because it's Lower Manhattan, $500,000 in order to run. I ran 2 races. I ran in the special election on the Working Families Party line, and I also ran for the Democratic primary during the regular election cycle after I lost the special election. And I won the Democratic line during the primary, and I ran as a Democrat and won in the general as well. So,
did you have opponents who were raising similar or more amounts of money than you? Like $500,000 sounds like a lot, but what were other people doing?
They were around the same in the second race. I think that, because I ran 2 races, it sounds like so much more because I basically spent around $250,000 for each part of the race.
Got it.
And so it made it so that, I had to spend that entire amount and then another entire amount, and other people only had to raise half of what I raised in order to be competitive in the second portion of that whole thing. So the special election itself, since it was a separate election, we had to do a lot of things differently because that was the Democratic nominee was picked by something here that we have that's called the county committee selection process. And so the county committee was the ones that selected the Democratic nominee. County committee members, there's 2 for each electoral district, and each electoral district's person is nominated by their club that they belong to in that section. So you don't even have to live in those EDs, but you can represent that entire ED. So it's a very interesting selection process. And I actually dropped out of that Democratic nomination process in order to go and critique it there and then run on the WFP line. And we know how hard it is to run on third party line, but I knew that after I did well there, that the voters went to look for me on a different line just to vote for me. And this is during the presidential Democratic primary. So they were switching and voting on a Working Families Party line, even though it was a Democratic primary election at the same time at the poll booth. So a lot of people, when they're voting just Democrat, they didn't realize. But so many voters were educated and voted for me that I knew that next race, I had a very, very good shot.
That's great. That means that you got your message out really well to people. That's a hard thing to do, to get people to break that way. I'm wondering in particular, as a younger candidate, was social media something that was an important part of that outreach and education of voters? And kind of part 2 of this question is, did you find that because you are a younger candidate that more young people supported you? Or do the voters just kind of break the way that we expect them to break, where the older populations are voting more often?
I think that actually it was just the pure door knocking that made all of the difference. Social media can play some part of it. I think that people could read the news a little bit differently. But, you had mentioned endorsements before. I had a lot of endorsements, including the New York Times. And I think that kind of media outlet made it so that it was the kind of game changer for my race in a lot of ways. They had endorsed me in both the special election and then also in the primary for the Democratic primary in the actual full term election. And so, it made a huge difference because I think that, in Manhattan, especially in Lower Manhattan, we have a lot of amazingly educated voters who actually are conscientious and thoughtful about where they're putting their vote. It's actually people create whole outings for it.
Yeah.
To make sure to get out the vote. And, it was, one of the biggest things I think that people didn't think about was what I was thinking about constantly. A lot of people thought that this would be a race-based race. Like, people would look at ethnicity and, vote according to their ethnicity. But I never thought that way. I always thought that it would be what the district needed was a unifying person, somebody who was not trying to divide anybody, but to try to unify everyone. And I knew that to be true because this is a community that lives together and works together and survived 9/11 and survived Hurricane Sandy and survived all manners of rebuild. And so I think that, it was incredibly important to make sure that we had a voice that was one of unification. And I always put all of my communities, into the perspective of the fact that we are actually all neighbors and that we have these similar experiences. And that was what was so important.
That's great. I want to talk a little bit about the 500,000 number, because I think some folks who are listening to this that are running in some down ballot race just had a heart attack when they heard that you had to raise $500,000. And maybe we can break that down a little bit. So this was two races. The unusual circumstances around this seat, there was an indictment for the incumbent that caused a special election. So there were really two separate elections, and correct me if I'm stating this incorrectly at all, but there were two separate elections. And it was in April of 2016, correct?
Do you want me to want me to actually stop and go back?
Nope.
I'm sorry if the questions are.
No, I don't think you need to. No, you totally are. It just, I know that people are going to hear 500,000 and go, oh my God, I have to raise $500,000 to win my legislative seat.
No.
And so you don't need to go over that at all. I just wanted to kind of get it straight in my brain too, that these were two separate election cycles, a special election, and then turning around and running what would be probably what most people are going to experience, which is a regular election cycle with a primary and a general election.
That's right.
And then what are your contribution limits in a race like that?
4,400 on the state level.
Okay.
Yeah, we have no match. We have no campaign finance, so we have no match.
Got it.
It's 4,400 is our limit, and we have a different one for LLCs and corporations, which is just a little bit higher. But it's only per year, so it's not like you do it per leg of the race. So, for example, like for the primary, there's a 4,400 max for an individual, but then for the general, it counts as a whole nother race, and so they can max out again if you can find such individuals. I did not have that many, but I was always small dollar donations, and it was just a number of people, and it was just incredible amounts of support from friends and family in my first circle. So it really made the difference,
Yeah.
I think that you really have to overcome a lot to be able to make that kind of ask. That's why it's so hard, especially for women and women of color and people of color in general. I think that it's much harder for us to be able to tap into ready-made community networks. It's just harder because we don't have that ready-made club platform or the platform of people who have generation after generation after generation been used to giving. And so we have to build it ourselves.
Right. And then add to it the fact that you were 32 when you ran, so you didn't have, 40 years of experience at a law firm, right? Where you knew tons of,
going to shovel the money your direction.
Exactly, right? I mean, so you had some unique challenge, unique obstacles to overcome to do this. How many hours were you spending on call time, for example, a week?
So this is where social media comes in. I actually spent a lot of my time Facebook chatting. I know that sounds really silly, but actually Facebook chat is incredibly helpful when a young person is fundraising for the very, very first time. I'm going to put that out there, and people can debate me if they want, but it was actually how I raised the most of my small dollar donations. And because of my age, because of, just not having that systemic fundraising mechanism that's like this machine out there that so many other people have. I just had to think of new ways to fundraise. You know, there's a lot of folks who like my friends, they're not like hedge fund managers like that are 70 years old. Like, I mean, I have a couple, but they're not, there's not that many. Like most of them are like, I'm a yoga instructor and I cook for a living or like whatever, you know? And so like, you know, it makes it so that all the $5 donations, $10 donations, $20 donations added up and stacked up, and each person mattered.
So were you actually collecting that money through the Facebook Messenger like plugin that lets you send money through Messenger, or were you just using it as ways to contact people?
I was just using it as a way to contact people. Okay. I couldn't pay extra. I didn't have that money. Yeah. I mean, I never did like the extra things. Like at max, I spent, I think, like $20 on Facebook to help like to promote like 1 or 2 events or something like that. But for me, it was really about contacting people that I already knew, that already loved me and wanted me to run for office already, you know, and it was just making sure that they knew that this was the time to give, because most of the time it's about the ask, and people are just waiting for you to ask, honestly. But it's really hard to get over like the shame of it, yeah. and your own pride, and the fact that you've you know, you've never asked for something like this before, and it's really hard to brag about yourself or to tell other people about you in a way that makes them like makes you feel like you're putting yourself out there or promoting yourself. You know, it's especially hard. That part was really hard, and after you run for office, you'll realize you have no pride or shame or any of that. So.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, it's completely gone. Yeah.
What is the one thing that surprised you most about your race?
I think the young people that came out was the most inspiring. I remember being there as a young person too, you know, but this was on a different level. I had over 300 volunteers for my race. That's and these amazing. Are all young people who had never been in politics before, for the majority. And this is the first time that they felt like they wanted to be involved, because there was a candidate that spoke like them, looked like them. And I didn't think of it that way, but that's what they told me. And I realized then how important that was, you know, that I was running. And I think that was part of what drove me every single day, because these young people, you know, for the first time felt like they had access to government. And so that was really emotional. But it made it so that it changed and drove everything. Yeah. Because it made me feel like I'm part of something much bigger.
Right. So then tell us what election day was like. How'd you prepare for it? And then like,
what'd you do to keep yourself busy before the results rolled in?
Yeah, exactly.
Like...
I was busy up until the end, and we were actually out flyering in front of a poll site. I never stopped. I think that was one of the things that really helped to make everybody work even harder in a lot of ways, because I think when you're constantly being the person that works the hardest, it makes it so that everybody else is like, oh my gosh, I have to keep going. And I had volunteers that were so incredible. They started at 5 a.m. in the morning with me at a subway stop, and didn't stop until like 2 in the morning the next day. And then they got up and did it again. I mean, this was, you know, young people,
yeah. With the stamina.
High schoolers, college students. Like, I mean, I couldn't believe it. You know, this is when I'm running, you know, I feel like I need to do it, but like these are young people who aren't getting paid. They're not able to go anywhere usually without their parents' permission. This is folks who are willing to work that hard because they wanted to help to change what they saw in government.
Yeah.
And I thought that was incredible. And, you know, that was kind of what needed to happen to win.
Yeah. So what was the celebratory nature of your election night party? Walk us through that.
So there's actually a really amazing story that a reporter actually wrote about my staff, actually. It's in a magazine called Slanted, and it's an Asian American magazine that's kind of like a stick to zine. It's full of like amazing things like poetry and art and all these things. And it's new, it's brand new, and it's focusing on young Asian Americans and their new voice. And I think that my friend Dan Huang, his name is Dan Huang, but he goes by Dan Shin as a writer. And he put together this article focusing on my staff, not on me, but it really kind of captured election night because he was interviewing them and following me around that night. Election night was crazy. The general election, though, we were so sad.
Yeah.
Because that was also the day that Donald Trump became president.
Right.
And it was a little bit shocking because there was no celebration. It was just pure shock. And we worked all the way to the very end. And then when we came in to see the numbers, nobody could believe it. And I actually went from my own election night, quote unquote celebration, which wasn't really a celebration, to the WFP one, where everybody was devastated. We were devastated. So we just stood there watching it all roll in, and everybody was kind of sitting there hoping that the numbers would change, but they didn't.
Yeah. We will include a link to the slanted article in the show notes for folks who are interested in reading it as well. Let's talk about your life now that you're in office.
Yay.
Get a sense of what it's like being a young person in Albany. First, before we get into, the day-to-day life, what did you do between Election Day and your swearing in? Did you take some time to decompress? Did you go out of town? Was it just about transition and getting up to speed quickly? What was it like for you?
Well, I knew that my district actually had not had representation for a very long time. And so I started doing constituent casework. I had my staff up and ready to go before the year started, and we started taking constituent cases on our own phones and things like that. So
Wow.
We made sure that we were getting back to people who we had talked to during the race, and especially when we were looking at things like the still happening after effects of 9/11. We were still when we door knocked, we found out that a lot of people had been sick in different ways, and they didn't know that their neighbors were sick in the same way. Mm. And so there was a lot of things that we tried to follow up with as we went along. And then we wanted to make sure that we kept our promise that we were up and ready to roll on day one. So all of our efforts were, of course, trying to make it so that our office was open literally on the day of January 2nd, so that people could start calling in, helping to make sure that everybody knew that we were up and were a resource for them in the district. So that was kind of where we were at. We didn't really take a break. My staff started transitioning in and out according to campaign versus district office staff. And then we had to make a lot of decisions on, what we want to, kind of put out for events and things like that in the first month. And then I had a inauguration the day before Trump's inauguration, which was really hard. But I think that it made it so that, some people felt like we had some hope. And I think it made a lot of difference for our district.
Well, and so now you get to be the representative and work on issues that matter to you and your constituents. So can you tell us a few of the key issues that you're working on now or that you worked on in the very beginning?
Sure. Yeah. So one of the things that we worked on a lot is to bring social services like NORCs and funding for NORCs for our seniors. I don't know if you guys know what NORCs are, but they're naturally occurring retirement communities. So there are programs that help our seniors to be able to stay in their homes and stay active and stay social in order to make sure that, they don't go into assisted living too early, or that they don't need to have other outside help or to move into a senior home or anything like that. So it's one of those amazing programs that are just totally preventative and a really great investment in our communities. So, I worked on trying to secure financial resources for them. I also worked on making sure that we had a financial services package that I'm starting with right now with our speaker's office, et cetera. We pushed a a couple of different things for NYCHA. We made sure that NYCHA had more money than they ever gotten from the state. It's still not enough. It's still a drop in the bucket. NYCHA is our New York City Housing Authority, and the federal government had stopped funding NYCHA a while back, and it made it so that a lot of the capital needs were kind of, I guess, compounding year after year after year. And so the cost and the living conditions were horrible. And so we brought back $200 million for NYCHA on the state level. The most that had ever been brought back was $100 million. And so we were able to actually double that. And that was an incredible win for us.
Nice.
We worked on a lot of different things. And also we established the first Asian Pacific American Legislative Task Force. This is the first time, after my election, this is the first time that we've ever had 2 Asian American electives at the same time on the state level. And so we were able to put together a group to be able to actually focus on, legislatively, or legislative body focused on looking at issues and pushing priorities that affected the Asian American communities, which was the first ever. And we wouldn't have been able to do that without our speaker, Carl Hastie, kind of helping us to be able to make it possible. So these are all kinds of things that I worked on throughout the year. And there's a lot of issues that are more slow rolling, which is like affordable housing. We need to fix our affordable housing issues in our state. We have affordability crisis here in New York, and there are like certain regulations that are very much, pro-landlord and not pro-tenant. And so we're trying to make sure that we can better serve our tenants.
Yeah, it's so super important. I work in housing and homelessness here in Washington, and the tenants' rights stuff is big on our state legislative agenda too. So good to know that awesome. Like across the country, we're having this conversation about tenants' rights, and renters are real people.
To wrap up the conversation, if you knew then what you knew now about running for office, particularly, as a young person running for office, what would you do differently, if anything?
I think there's a lot of things that I took to heart that I should never have internalized. And I think that was one of the things that I would put out there for a lot of folks. When people comment on, say, for example, your age or your ethnicity or things like that. Like when people comment on your age, it's not ageism. It's actually most likely sexism. For me anyway, as a young woman, I started to notice that when a young man is running, generally people saying, wow, he's so ambitious and so driven and such a go-getter. Whereas with women, they ask, like, what are you going to do about raising a family? And you're so young. Do you have enough experience? Do you think that you are ready? And it didn't matter that I had over 15 years of legislative experience under my belt. It didn't seem to matter that I had been working in the legislature since I was 17 years old. It didn't seem to matter. But whereas, like, when it's an older white man, for example, then it would be like, wow, he has 3 years of legislative experience. He's a veteran. And for me, like 15 years did not matter, Right. And so it's really about trying to keep in mind and keep in perspective who you really are, and also like not internalize all of those things. Because I have a lot of internalized depression. I don't know about all of you guys, but I do. I have like mad chip on my shoulder in a lot of ways because people are constantly saying things that make it so, it's continuous. And so in my head, I already say things worse to myself than other people can say to me. And so when other people are saying things, it's better to just smile, nod, and say thank you, take it into consideration, and then don't. Because I think that, as a woman, you'll realize that people care a lot about your appearance, and they really shouldn't. People are always going to say that you're too something, right? You've got your hair is too long. Your hair is too short. You smile too much. You don't smile enough. Your skirt is too long. Your skirt is too short. Your
earrings are too big.
Too funny. Your earrings are too big. All of it.
I gave that advice once to a candidate. That's why Rainey's throwing it back in my face. Because I said, It's just like an obnoxious tie. If they're looking at your tie or they're looking at your earrings, they're not listening to what's coming out of your mouth. That's the only reason that I gave that advice. I give that to both men and women. Don't wear anything that distracts from the words that are coming out of your mouth. That's it. I want to be clear about that.
As a kid who was working in the legislature, I was almost anal retentive about dressing properly, etc. But I still remember that there was a woman who was actually my boss, and she actually told me that, I really should watch how I dress because I shouldn't wear heels. And I felt like that was crazy because my mentors all wore heels. Shiheo Kim wears heels. Sharon Tomiko Santos wears heels. And why was it that, I couldn't wear heels? I never wore a shirt that was too low or a skirt that was too high or whatever. People are always going to have their opinion, but it was heartbreaking to me because it was a woman and it was another woman who said that to me. And all I can say is there's nothing inappropriate with how anybody chooses to dress or where to work. But I think that it's really important to make sure that we are defending one another and that we are helping to create a better and safer environment for women to work in, period. And that includes other women trying to hurt other women. So.
Yeah. Amen. So just to wrap up our final question here, this is your opportunity to brag about your district. Tell us what's, great about the 65th Assembly District.
Oh, I haven't bragged about it enough.
What do we all need to know?
Well, you said it was gorgeous.
It is the center of the universe. And we have amazing food. You can walk down the street and every other block, there's probably a different kind of food from some part of the world that you can just, it would usually cost you like $1,500 round trip ticket to go somewhere else. But here you only have to walk down one block. So you can walk around the world just in my district. It's really, really, really amazing. The people here are the best. It's where people have incredible strength and everybody's, survived a lot. And it makes it so that they have a common bond. And it makes it so that we all work together in an incredible way. And so I hope that everybody will come and check out Lower Manhattan because
I'm getting on a plane right now.
Said, I was like I said, it is the birthplace of America and now is the center of the universe. I mean, it's just the best. So get your tickets.
Amazing.
It's awesome.
Well, this was an excellent conversation. Very inspiring story. Thank you for sharing, your fantastic insight and advice for first-time candidates who are thinking about making the leap and jumping into it. So, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, and edit me to sound smarter. Thanks.
No need. Have a good one, and we'll talk to you soon.
All right.
Bye.
Bye to you soon. Bye.
Bye. Another big thank you to Assemblywoman Yuh-Line Niou for taking time out today and walking us through her race and some of the challenges and obstacles. It was such a great interview. It's very inspiring to hear stories like that and just kind of break down the mystery around how do you get going. And
yeah, well, and she's starting so young, being 17, getting her first internship in a state legislature.
Right.
At 17, it never would have occurred to me to go do something like that or that I had access to that. I loved what she said about the big secret that everyone is keeping is that you have access to government.
Right.
And I think for folks who listen to our podcast, that's probably the most important takeaway, right? Is you can be a young person and run for office. You don't have to have particular experience. I think, matching your district and knowing what the issues are that your district cares about are the most important factors for running for office. And I think Yuh-Line nailed that.
Absolutely. And I also think people need to understand that it's doable, right? That even after a car accident, she still cranked out 9,000 doors, even though she had not had tons of hedge fund manager friends, she still could raise $500,000. Even though she lost her special election, she still could turn around and pull out a victory, months later. That is a perseverance that I think is an important takeaway from the discussion.
Well, and getting creative about how you raise money, using Facebook Messenger to just contact people who you know really well. If you think about the time saving that comes with that, because you can send a bunch of messages and have multiple chats going at one time versus like sitting and making phone calls. And
or opening your Gmail and copying and pasting emails and then crafting you don't have to do all of that. And I think the other takeaway from this, other than the perseverance, I think, is the creativity that you need to do to overcome your obstacles, right? So don't let that be an impediment. Don't let it stop you in your tracks. It's not paralysis time. It's time to think around the problem, right? So I think all of that was particularly helpful. So really appreciated her taking the time.
Exciting.
And thank you to our listeners again for joining us on another episode of Election University Podcast. We really appreciate it. We'd love it if you went over to wherever you're listening to us, iTunes, Google Play Music, Stitcher, or even on the website, and leaving us a review. We appreciate that. We take the advice and we listen to it, and we want to provide better service to our listeners.
And I think sending us, if you have suggestions on topics or types of people you would like to hear from, we're always open to those ideas. We want this podcast to be useful for you. So we recognize that we're not the only people in the world who have good ideas on who to talk to and what to talk about. And you can email us at podcast@electionu.com.
Exactly. And on behalf of Rainey Cohen and myself, we appreciate you tuning in. And until next week,
bye.
Have a good one.
Thank you for listening. This week's episode has ended, but the campaign fun doesn't have to. Head on over to www.electionu.com, where you can access all of the links mentioned in today's episode, as well as the show notes. There you can also sign up for regular announcements or register for our campaign school. It's your very own online personal trainer for winning campaigns. www.electionu.com. Click, learn, win.